Hello, everybody. I'm Silas, and welcome to Psilocybology. Let's expand our mind. This is a series where we talk about the research on psilocybin, the psychedelic prodrug found in magic mushrooms. We'll be breaking down and discussing the scientific literature, one study at a time, from past to present. If you'd like to support the show, please make sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. Before we get into today's episode, a new listener reached out recently and seemed to be frustrated with how I pronounce psilocybin. I know I already talked about this on an earlier episode, but for any new listeners, although many people, particularly Americans, pronounce it psilocybin, it can also be pronounced psilocybin. If you don't believe me, go to the online Oxford English Dictionary or the Merriam-Webster Dictionary. The main reason I call it psilocybin isn't because I have anything against the other pronunciation, it's just because that's how I learned it. I will also say, though, the other reason I say psilocybin is because the genus of mushroom that psilocybin comes from is called Psilocybe, and yes, apparently the E at the end is not silent, although I wish it was. If you go to the Wikipedia page for the genus Psilocybe, you can see the pronunciation listed as capital S-Y, lowercase l-o-h, capital S-Y, lowercase b-e-e. Drop the E at the end and add an I-N, and you get psilocybin. Simple as that. I know it can be a bit distracting sometimes to hear a word pronounced one way when you learned it a different way, but hopefully it isn't preventing anyone from listening to the podcast. If my pronunciation really is bothering or frustrating anyone to the point where it stops you from being able to enjoy the content, I genuinely empathize. I mentioned part of the story previously on the podcast, but I had this professor who pronounced methadone as methadone, and at one point it made me legitimately angry. I was listening to one of his recorded lectures and I started cursing at my laptop, calling him an idiot and incompetent. When I realized how upset I was getting, I closed my laptop and took a moment to ask myself if my level of frustration was justified, and if there wasn't something else that I was actually upset about. Earlier in the day, I had been hurting myself because I was overwhelmed by how much studying I had to do, and I was worried I was going to fail his class. Unfortunately, because I had tied so much of my identity and self-worth to my academics, in my mind, failing would then mean I was an idiot and incompetent. Getting upset with his pronunciation made me feel better, in part because it was a distraction from the anger I had with myself, but also because it meant I could blame him for my inability to learn from his lectures. Obviously, that's not true. And once I took the time to introspect, I was able to remind myself that I really enjoyed the content he was teaching, and that I shouldn't let some difference in pronunciation stop me from learning valuable information. Besides, maybe he was German, in which case the singular form of methadone doesn't have the E at the end, so it would then actually be pronounced methadone. Anyway, if hearing psilocybin makes you feel the way I did when I first heard methadone, I'm sorry for what you might be feeling right now. And if you ever want to talk, you know where to reach me. With that lengthy opening remark, let's get into the articles for today. Today's episode is on two articles that both present data on the same group of participants. The first study is titled Similarity of Schizophrenia and the Psilocybin Syndrome as Determined by Objective Methods, and the second is titled, quote, Consistency of Psilocybin-Induced Changes in the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. Both studies were published in 1965 by researchers from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. I don't want to spoil anything, but please make sure to listen to the end of the episode today before drawing any conclusions about the data. These episodes are pretty short, so hopefully that isn't too difficult. The reason I say that is because the second study does impact the interpretation of the data from the first. The experiment that these researchers conducted is rather simple. First, 12 participants were asked to complete the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, or MMPI. Then, the following day, these participants were given 0.2 milligrams of psilocybin per kilogram of body weight. So a 70 kilogram or 154 pound individual would have received a total dose of 14 milligrams, which is on the lower end, but definitely enough to elicit a response. Finally, the participants were asked to complete the MMPI a second time but this time 90 minutes after drug administration. Some of you may already be familiar with the MMPI, but let's start by discussing the basics of what this personality inventory is, how it was developed, and why the researchers chose to use this particular assessment. The MMPI is a questionnaire that was designed to aid in the diagnosis of adult psychopathology, and was initially developed with a set of subscales, each scale corresponding to either a specific mental health diagnosis or personality trait. Its methodology has been noted as rather unique for the time, because it was developed by administering a large number of questions to individuals with known diagnoses, and then examining which items those individuals did and did not endorse. The theory behind the assessment is that once you establish the pattern of responses for, say, patients with schizophrenia, then if someone undiagnosed takes the questionnaire and answers the questions in the same way as one of those patients, then they may also have schizophrenia. Now, the original MMPI was developed in the late 30s and 40s, and was not substantially revised until 1989, so the researchers in this study used the original version. This already places some limitations on the research, because many have criticized the original MMPI, particularly for the control sample used to identify the pattern of responses for healthy individuals. Not only was this control sample very small, it also apparently consisted of many family members of psychiatric patients who were allowed to participate as long as they indicated they weren't currently being treated for a mental health problem. Since mental illness has a hereditary component and is also influenced by shared environmental factors, it's possible some of the individuals in the control group actually did have a mental health problem, but were undiagnosed or untreated. As we already alluded to, one of the scales on the MMPI used in this study is called the schizophrenia scale. There were also scales for hypochondriasis, depression, hysteria, psychopathy, paranoia, psychasthenia, and hypomania. In addition, there were also scales that attempted to assess how accurate and honest participants were in answering the questions. Specifically, these three scales measured level of confusion, the tendency to exaggerate their symptoms, and their defensiveness. The main reason the researchers of the study chose to use the MMPI is specifically because of the schizophrenia scale. This study, according to the author, was concerned with, quote, objectively demonstrating resemblance between the psilocybin reaction and schizophrenia. As we've discussed before, many early researchers into psychedelics erroneously believed that psychedelics produce states similar to those experienced by schizophrenia, and would often ignore or reject evidence to the contrary. For example, in the introduction of the first study, the author actually acknowledges some scientists in the field who have pointed out that the hallucinations produced by psilocybin are very different in character from those experienced by patients with schizophrenia. David Nutt actually briefly discussed this in his recent book on the harms of legal and illegal drugs, namely that hallucinations produced by psychedelics tend to be more visual and are based on the environment, whereas hallucinations in patients with schizophrenia tend to be auditory and are also more likely to be negative and frightening. The author responds to this point by essentially stating hallucinations just aren't an important symptom in schizophrenia anyway, so it matters more whether psilocybin produces changes in personality that resemble the personality of schizophrenic patients. Hence why the author chose to conduct this experiment using a personality assessment designed to diagnose schizophrenia. So now that we have that background and introduction, let's dive into the results of Study 1. Again, the day before the study, participants took the MMPI. Then the day of the study, they were given psilocybin, and 90 minutes post-administration, they were asked to retake the MMPI. The main outcome of the study was the change in score between the baseline measure and the measure taken during the psychedelic experience. What the researchers found was that out of the 11 scales assessed, participants scored higher on both the hypochondriasis and schizophrenia scales when administered after taking psilocybin. Now, the author basically decided to just call it a day and made the claim that psilocybin produces an experience similar to schizophrenia, and interestingly decided not to focus on the increase seen in the hypochondriasis scale. Let's do our due diligence and examine the results a bit closer. First off, it'll be important for interpretation to understand what the MMPI criteria were for diagnosing schizophrenia. According to a 1978 paper, so still using the original MMPI, part of the criteria was a schizophrenia subscale score greater than or equal to 80, in combination with an F score, F standing for the scale measuring one's tendency to exaggerate their symptoms, between 75 and 95. This criteria was able to reliably diagnose 72% of patients with schizophrenia and only incorrectly diagnosed 5.5% of non-schizophrenic controls, meaning that there is a low number of false positives using this criteria. Others have shown that a more liberal cutoff could be a score of 70 on the schizophrenia subscale, although this introduces a greater risk of false positives. Knowing that, let's take a look at the scores in this study. Prior to being given psilocybin, participants scored an average of 54.3 on the schizophrenia scale and 52 on the F scale. After taking psilocybin, participants scored an average of 62.8 on the schizophrenia scale and 55.3 on the F scale. This doesn't even come close to the criteria for diagnosing schizophrenia. Let's also, though, discuss another problem with these results. Just scoring higher on the schizophrenia subscale does not indicate a diagnosis of schizophrenia or even similar pathology. For example, one study examining the schizophrenia subscale found that many chronic pain patients also had a score above 70 on the schizophrenia subscale, despite none having schizophrenia. This was because some of the items included on this subscale had to do with somatic symptoms like pain, nausea, etc., which are clearly not unique symptoms indicative of schizophrenia. Plus, as we discussed earlier, it's the overall pattern of responses that are used to indicate a given diagnosis, so not just how high they scored on one scale, but how high and how low one scored on the other scales as well. In light of all that, the author's claim in the first paper is misleading at best, but it gets worse. So far we've only discussed the first paper. Let's turn our attention to study number 2. This study was actually just an extension of the first, whereby the same 12 participants repeated the experiment 2 weeks after the initial trial. They did find the same increase in the hypochondriasis scale, as well as an increase in 4 of the other scales that were previously not found, but importantly, they found no significant increase in the schizophrenia scale. This is why the second study was titled Consistency of Psilocybin-Induced Changes in the MMPI, because their conclusion was that the changes were not very consistent between trials, despite being only 2 weeks apart. Ultimately, the evidence does not support that psilocybin produces experiences similar to schizophrenia. Even taking the increase in the hypochondriasis scale more seriously, this is still very difficult to interpret, since it was designed to measure a wide variety of vague and non-specific complaints of bodily functioning, with a substantial number of items focused on digestive difficulties. Given how often psilocybin produces digestive discomfort, that's possibly what this increase, which averaged only 5 points, was reflecting. Another limitation we haven't discussed that possibly contributed to the inconsistent results is that the MMPI has over 500 questions and takes about 90 minutes to complete. That's when you're not in an altered state of consciousness. I can't even imagine taking the MMPI during the peak of a psychedelic experience. If I was a participant, I would pretty quickly decide to remove myself from the study, or at the very least, I wouldn't be taking the time and energy required to carefully read and respond to each question honestly and thoughtfully. I also want to end by discussing one of my biggest frustrations with these studies. Although both papers were published in the same year, the first one was much more widely cited than the second. Google Scholar likely underestimates the number of times a paper has been cited when it comes to older research like those from the 60s, but I think we can still use it to get a sense of how much more one paper was referenced compared to the other. The first paper that claimed psilocybin produced an experience similar to schizophrenia was cited 23 times, according to Google Scholar, whereas the second paper, showing that those results were inconsistent between trials, was only cited 3 times. The first paper got over 7 times more recognition than the second. On top of that, unfortunately many people often cite a paper without fully analyzing the study itself, so they likely just quoted the title or a line from the abstract, and thus perpetuated the false myth that psilocybin produces psychotic experiences like those experienced by patients with schizophrenia. This then also makes it seem like there is a high risk for psilocybin to induce schizophrenia, which is blatantly false. I know we focused a lot on the negative aspects of these papers, for good reason, but I did want to at least end by noting that it is pretty interesting that psilocybin appeared to produce any changes at all on the MMPI. Although we'll discuss much higher quality research in the future, it's exciting to see that even as far back as the 1960s, evidence was starting to emerge that psilocybin may produce acute changes in personality. This has hugely significant implications, particularly in the realm of clinical psychology, because personality disorders are notoriously difficult to treat, precisely because personality, by definition, is a set of rather stable characteristics that often can take years to change. The fact that psilocybin may produce rapid changes in personality opens the doors for it to become the most powerful treatment option out there for those dealing with seemingly intractable psychopathologies. Well, that's it for today's episode. As always, I really hope you enjoyed the show. If you have any questions, feedback, or ideas for the podcast, please let me know. You can find out all the ways to reach me on the website, psilocybology.org, where you can also find the full transcript for each episode if interested. Thank you all for listening, and I'll talk to you next time.